What's up, everybody? Welcome to Podcast Now. I'm Alex, and in this video, I want to talk about games being fine. Is that okay? Is it okay for a game to come out and be average, be fine? Now, technically, you could probably apply this to more than just games. You go movies, television, etc. But this came about from a Dragon Age video I did a few days ago, and there was a person subscribed to me for a couple of years, and we were getting into a back and forth. But you know what? I respect it, and I've always said, if you come at me respectfully, even if it's a disagreement, I'm willing to come at you respectfully and have a conversation. And you know what? I'm so into it that I'm willing to make a whole video. But I think it's an interesting topic. It's the weekend. I sometimes try to throw together these more conversation pieces and see what you guys think. You tend to like them, and you can let me know, I guess, if you don't like them. But here's the thing. Okay, can a game be fine, and is that okay? So where I kind of stand on this, well, number one, it really just depends on the person. And that sounds like a cop-out, but I definitely want to kind of go more in depth to it, okay? So the idea of, okay, well, games, there needs to be some games that are average, right? That actually was kind of the conversation me and this individual were kind of going back and forth with. If no game was ever average, right? No game was ever fine. So I say fine. I mean, you could say average, you could say below average, you could say whatever you want, right? Your own metric. If games weren't like that, then you could never really have games that, are superior, right? A game that's a generational game. Well, what makes a generational game? Well, it's being better than like the other games. Well, if you don't have games that are less than superior, you'll never have a game that's superior. Okay, now that's a fine way, I think, of looking at it, and I think that's fair. Like, games can come out and they can be just whatever, right? They can exist, they can play on your. That's kind of how I describe Dragon Age, right? The more I'm playing it, it's a game that's playing. I'm pressing buttons, things are happening, there's story, there's words, I'm hearing things, I'm processing things, but at the same time, it doesn't really feel like a lot's happening, right? And there are plenty of games like that. And, again, like taking just that side of the argument, you need some of those games to have games that are better than it. Now, okay, and I'm not saying, by the way, that's like his only point. Hopefully he understands that as well if he's watching this. But, okay, one thing that I said is, and this is a big stance, I guess, of mine, right? I guess the more I make these videos and the longer I'm around, everybody, I think, has the right to kind of declare what they're looking for. And so what I mean by that is, like, when you put a price tag on something, right, you're competing against everything else. This is where I think what I just said, right, kind of gets more messy because, yes, games are naturally going to come out and they're going to be fine. They're going to be not fine. They're going to be better than fine, right? Like, all of these things can happen to a game. But when you price it, okay, we're not talking about free demos. We're talking about a game that has a price tag. Okay, well, now you're looking at just the $70 games. Okay, so now when you put out a game that's $70, it is going up against every other game out there that's $70. Now, you can break it into genres, right? But it's also just going up against all of them. And so now there's expectations. Now there's, okay, well, you're 70. Well, here's another game that's 70. Well, now I kind of have to compare. Now, I'm not saying like you go through and it's in every comparison you can, but you hopefully people understand what I'm saying, right? You're putting a price tag on it. So now it's like, okay, well, now it's a fine game, but is a fine game worth $70? I guess that's one question. Is fine worth $70? Is it worth $60? Is it worth $50? And you can keep going, right? Is it worth $10? This is actually something I talk about all the time. It's why, this conversation was kind of interesting to me because I'm actually a pretty big supporter of people just making their own decision, right? If you like fine games, if you're okay with a game being average, that's great. I have nothing against that. If you have nothing against me, I have nothing against you. People can do that. People also put price tags on things. A game that I think is worth $100, you might think is worth $20, right? I've said this before, but I'll bring it up here because I think it's a good example. The first Life is Strange, right? One of my favorite games of all time. I mean, you could say it with any Kingdom Hearts, right? I can go through my list of the most favorite games, Sly Cooper's, right? I would pay hundreds of dollars to play those games, right? Say I could erase my mind, but I know that they were my favorite games, right? So I can take away the experience, but I still think they're my favorite games. And I was like, okay, well, price it. Like, what is it worth to you? What is playing Kingdom Hearts 2 worth to me? Hundreds of dollars. If you're comparing it to all other games out there, I would pay more for Kingdom Hearts 2 because it's just better, in my opinion, right? It's a better game. It's a game that connected. So, okay, I just did it, right? I just labeled it what I think of it. And that's generally how it works, right? A game that I think, Life is Strange, I would pay semi-hundred, like I'd pay multiple hundreds, I was gonna say millions. Jeez, I'm not that rich. Actually, I'm not rich at all. I'd pay many hundreds of dollars to play Life is Strange. Say if I knew it was good, but I didn't know my experience with it, I'd pay several hundred. You might pay 10. You might pay 10 because that's the price you've labeled it. So that's a big one. And honestly, that hurts I would say the argument of what I just said. It is true in terms of like judging and like if a game gets an award for something, right? It's going up against other games. Well, even to be nominated for that award, you've got to be better than the average, right? Like there's an average for performance. And then there's like the best performance. And now your best performance might be different than say the Game Awards, right? But they're picking the better ones. They're not picking it's not the average Game Awards, right? Where you're picking just, okay, everything that's average about any game we're throwing in this award. There's like the excellence to it, right? And again, like not every game can be that. That is totally true. But in my opinion, when it gets messy, and this is my answer to the question, right? Like, is it okay for a game to be fine? Of course it is. Like games have to kind of be fine, at least some games, right? Now I'm going somewhere actually even with that, but just to finish up my thought before I get too far away from it, everybody's got a price. I've said this even before with length, right? Like, and this is something I heavily disagree with portions of my audience, right? And I totally respect it. There's multiple people that I have seen over and over, right? And tens or hundreds of videos that say, hey, I need a game. If I'm paying $60, I need it to be like 30, 40, 50 hours. I'm not paying 60 for a game to be 6-7 hours. Now, I disagree. I've always disagreed with that, but that's what they've labeled. They've priced it as that, right? And that's okay. It's their money. You know what I mean? Like, that's the thing you gotta, I think, remember, or I try to stress, right? It's everybody's money. It's everybody's label on a product. Okay, now one final thing to this. In terms of personal preference, which, I mean, look, again, all of this is subjective. I'm just giving you my opinion, and you can totally disagree. In terms of personal preference, when I think of a fine game, and again, like, everybody's also got different time constraints. Like, you might only have an hour a day to play a game. Would you prefer to play a average game for that hour or a game that you think is really good? And by the way, again, going back, the game that you think is really good might actually be average to somebody else. So, we might not actually be getting anywhere with this conversation. But my own personal thing, when I think of a game that's average, I normally want something to really stand out. I was kind of alluding to this with Dragon Age, right? Where like the thing that bugs me about it is there's some like better than average things, like say the gameplay, right? Like the actual combat. I'm liking it. I like the combat, right? And I'm just using Dragon Age as an example because that's kind of what brought this whole thing up. Is there anything that really gets me, though, right? Like, again, going back to, say, like a Life is Strange, or pick any of kind of like the classics, right? Go back in your head. They might not shine at everything. And this is, again, how I think of like games that are like okay, right? I normally want them to have something. One thing. Just give me one. Give me one thing that's kind of like above and beyond. Now, the best games do many things. And again, like that goes back to the beginning, right? An elite game does multiple aspects well. So I guess like say Life is Strange, right? Like I love the artwork. Even though like say the visuals were not cutting edge at the time, I think they worked for what it was. I think the music is outstanding. I think the characters, I think the writing, I think the acting, I think, I can keep the themes, right? Now, okay, the gameplay is pretty weak. Like there isn't, there's like the rewind stuff, but in terms of like, inputs on the controller, you're not doing much as Max in Life is Strange. Okay, well that's a below average, but they excel at so many things. Now, that's maybe a bad example because I think that's like an elite game. But you pick any game that you would say, that's okay. That's a fine game. I'm looking for, honestly, maybe like Rise of the Ronin this year. So Rise of the Ronin is a game that I overall liked, but I would say and I think actually, to be honest, I think I like it more than Dragon Age, but I would say, okay, well that's, it's not like moving mountains. I'm not thinking about it every day. It's a fine game. I think, me not giving scores maybe hurts me in these kind of instances because I don't have a game I gave a 5 or 6 to because I don't believe in review scores. But, Rise of the Ronin I look back at as a solid game. Probably solid is the word I would use. Solid game, average game. But you know what? I can tell you one thing it really excels at is the combat. And that makes it stand out in my head. When I think of Rise of the Ronin, I think to the combat. Does that make, you know what I mean? It's something that really stands out. I really like the combat of it. Now, the rest of it is kind of just whatever. Now, that could change depending on the person, obviously, but say for me, right? Those are the fun, and I mean, that's one example. I mean, I've played thousands of games, so I mean, they're all kind of up here, but they're hard to bring out like in a moment's notice, so forgive me if I can't give you guys like 30 examples, but hopefully you catch what I'm trying to say, right? Like, that's me. When I think of a game that's average, I saw a post a couple days ago for like Dead Nation. You know, Dead Nation is a game that I don't know if is like a spectacular game, but I think of like the co-op elements. I think of like the top-down like actual shooting that stands out to me. Now, does it do anything like outstandingly well? Maybe not. Maybe just that, and nothing else is really outstandingly well. But I can think of like one thing. See, when it comes to a game like Dragon Age, $70, right, full price, and then can you think of something that really stands out to you? Now, maybe you can. That's totally, you know what I mean? But I mean, this came from the discussion of Dragon Age. There's really nothing that stands out to me. So when I say Dragon Age is a fine game, I mean, I'm taking all these averages of things that are very close to the line, right? Here's the line of average, and nothing in Dragon Age really goes super beyond it. Gameplay is better than average, but it's not outstanding, right? So it's like, okay, well then where does that fall, or where does the whole game fall? It falls in, it's a fine, you know what I mean? It's a fine game, and is it okay to be fine? Well, obviously, again, as we just talked about in this video, but that's how I kind of look at it. I mean, my own personal preference, can a game be fine or average? Are average games okay? Yes, they are, right? They're bound to happen. My own personal preference is I prefer average games that push something, right? Maybe it's got 6 elements, and one of them really stands out, and the other ones are average, or maybe even 1 or 2 are below average, right? But it makes up for it because one of it really stands out. There's other games, too, where, like, you think back and you think, like, more highly on them than they really were. Like, I always, you know, the first game I ever remember myself playing, literally as a 5-year-old, is Crash Bash. Okay, now I think to that game, I think that game is like one of the greatest games ever as well. But I mean, that's kind of me exaggerating that point, and it's just very special to me, right? I think if I went back to play Crash Bash, there'd be some. But I'll end it on this, and this is something I told this individual as well, and this is all out of respect. This is not me. I thought this was an interesting video, and this is kind of a shameless plug for my third channel podcast, Now Back to the Past. Honestly, like I think I've evolved as like a commentator, you know, for gaming. I think I've gotten better at it, okay? Not to like pat my back, not to make it that, but you know, in that channel or for that channel, I've played like 150 old games, right? Like I've gone back, it's almost 2 years. That channel is almost 2 years old. I've gone through so many, and I've got a long, long list and hundreds of games over there physically because it's a preservation channel. I got so many games I want to go back to. And what I find, I think, by doing that is I refine this kind of like section in my brain. Everything I just told you guys in this video, a lot of it kind of stems from that. I don't know if I would have thought the things I'm saying to you or had this kind of just perspective of it if I didn't have that channel, because I'm putting my money where my mouth is, number one. Number two, I'm putting my experience where my mouth is. I've legitimately gone back to play some of these games, and now do all of them hold up? No, they do not. Not all of them. But what's fascinating, and I think it's shown in my 150 plus videos over there, normally there's a couple things that stand out, right? Now, like the legendary old games, there's many things that still stand out, and they still can hold up to this day. But even, you know, a part of that channel is me trying to look at the good side, right? I do very limited negative videos there. I've maybe covered 5 or 6 games in a negative way. The rest, I'd say 95% are positive, even if it's just a couple things about a game that stand out years later. Because, you know, visuals, actually most times, visuals do not hold up, right? Depends on the art style, but, you know, some art styles do not hold up. So some of those things, like, you know, you just immediately write off and say, okay, those might have been good back then, but they don't hold up now. So you're almost looking for, okay, what's the standout? If I'm playing a game from 10, 15 years ago, I played the Dragon Ball Budokai games, right? From 2001 and then maybe 2, 3, or 3, 4, you know, so the early 2000s. Like, is everything in that game going to hold up? No, but because of like that I don't know, part of my mind and part of the purpose of that channel is to go back and say, okay, well, like, were these games special, and what makes them special now? And that's what I try to do. So again, I guess it is like a shameless, you know, plug towards it, but I feel like I've kind of refined that part where it's like I do look for those things. And so my own personal thing is, I haven't played it yet at the time, I'm recording this video, but like Slitterhead, right? Slitterhead's the game that's coming out now, and that game's got 3s and 4s and 5s in reviews, and it's also got 7s and 8s, and it's being looked at as actually kind of a below average game. But is there something to that, right? Like, that's a new example. Does Slitterhead have something about it that's maybe really, really cool, and then it's held back? Sure, like, you're not going to call it game of the year because it's held back by like 6 other things that are like either average or below average, but maybe it does like 1 or 2 really special things, and you need games like that. So again, like, the final answer is yes, but my own preference is if you're going to be an average game, you got to do something. Like, being average and having everything be average is the worst kind of average. Does that make sense? Does that sound stupid? If I play an average game, and also, again, depends on the time. Like, I have my own time schedule. I got my own money situation. Like, maybe your situation's different than mine. Maybe you can afford or not afford to try more things out, right? And then you'd be more okay or less okay with it, right? But like, when I play a game, my own personal, just day-to-day life, right? If it's an average game, I'm looking for something to stand out. My honest, thing here is, if I'm playing a fine or average game, I need something that sticks out about it. I can't, I can, I guess, but I would prefer not to play a game that's average across the board. I would like 1 or 2 things to kind of stand out. So can a game be average? Yes, and I think it's bound to happen, and in a way it needs to happen, quote unquote. But for me, it's like, okay, you can be an average game. You can get a 5 out of 10, but can you have something that's like a 9 out of 10 and then a bunch of things that are like 3s, 4s, 5s, 6s, right? And they average out to be a 5. The game averages out to be average, but then you have like one killer thing about it. Those are the experiences I look for. That's not the case for everybody, right? But that's why I kind of want to make this video. So let me know what you think in the comments. Make sure you subscribe to the channel. Bell icons turned on. I hope to see you all on the next one.